Welcome to your equity topics video. Our first thing on the agenda is to establish what equality and equity actually mean and the difference between the two. So many of us have seen these images, maybe posted on social media and sent around the internet. The idea of equality means that all people get the same treatment and the same resources. Equity, however, means that we recognize that some need more than others. Some need a little bit of help, some need a lot of help, some need no help. And so we adjust what we give to accommodate those needs. Our education system has shifted away from equality to an equity focus over the last couple decades. And our goal is to get to where we, as a society, remove those barriers completely. However, we recognize that we can't do all of that all the time in our classrooms, but that can be our goal. Okay, so every presentation will have these same resources. These are just wonderful places for you to check out if you're interested in learning a little bit more about any of the topics that we discuss in these equity videos, because these are resources like the ACLU, Kids Data, and then the CSU has a whole diversity toolkit available for you that you can sift through and find some great information. Our first topic that we're going to cover is race and culture. Now, this is a very uncomfortable topic for many people. And I think the important thing for us to think about as educators is how do we make this something that is comfortable to talk about so that we can actually address some of the equity issues that our students face. So in order to do that, we must understand capital. So what is capital? Because when we talk about equity, that means some have more capital than others. And so there are three kinds: economic, social, and cultural. We'll talk about some of those in this presentation. Some of them will be in other videos. So the one we're going to focus on is cultural capital. And that's because cultural capital has to do with education, language, and customs that are prevalent in the dominant culture. Therefore, if you are not a member of the dominant culture, the largest group, or the group with the most power, then your cultural capital may not get you as far in our society, and it might be deemed less valuable. And so this is something we have to think about in our education system. How do we value that cultural capital and use it in our classrooms? So let me move this out of the way here. Our theories related to the concept of race are important. The first one that I really want you to remember is that race is a social construct. It is not biology. And a lot of us believe, we've been trained to believe that people are just very different from one racial group to the next, and it's a scientific thing. But in fact, it actually is not. So the variance between racial groups are only about 6% biologically and genetically. Therefore, if you took someone like me and someone of a very different racial group and someone who looked similar to me, we'd still all probably have about 6% variance. So if you look at this map down here at the bottom, it reminds us that there are geographical and environmental reasons for skin tone variation, but our modern understanding of race actually goes beyond that, despite what some people try to make us believe or simplify it to something very archaic, like the color of skin. And we know in our modern world that isn't true or relevant. If you look at these good-looking celebrities at the bottom, we have pictures of 4 people who would probably identify as a very different racial group, and yet their skin tone is about the same. So we know it's not color of skin. So what is it then? We know it has to do more with culture and identifying with certain groups, and that's why we tend to do that. And that's why it is a social construct, not biological. People categorize themselves, put each other in groups and label each other, and that's part of what we do as human beings. So knowing that is important. Other important concepts to think about when we talk about race and culture are the achievement gap versus the concept of the opportunity gap. And you're going to hear this again in other videos, but there's a link there that will lead you to a really interesting article that explains that. The idea is that in the past, we often compare different groups of students and saw an achievement gap, meaning that some were outperforming others by vast margins. And so we question, how do we deal with that underachievement or the lack of achievement that we perceive through those assessments? When now scholars are pushing us as educators to look at the opportunity gap instead, that it's not necessarily an achievement problem, it's an opportunity problem. Are we giving the same opportunities to those other groups? And that's the big question we need to consider. There's a study I want you to think about that really raises a question of how children perceive race and how they construct an understanding of their own identity. So two psychologists, Clark and Clark, did a test with dolls, and they found that many students, young children actually, regardless of their own race, when presented with dolls that look different, would be told, pick the best doll, and would pick the white doll. Almost unanimously. And so that's a big question. What trains children to think that one race is more important or better than another? And the fact that very young children are internalizing negative things about their own identity is really an ugly fact that we need to address in our classrooms. So we need to think about, how do we bolster that? Part of that comes from multicultural education and ethnic studies. We want to push for that sense of identity that's positive, and address some of those things that maybe have been left out of education in the past. So some research to back this up. First off, I will always include this link to DataQuest, where you can look up some demographics of schools near you. Some other research you need to think about, some historical facts. Brown versus Board of Education was one of the biggest changes in our school system history in the United States. It basically said that we can no longer separate children by race in their schools. Separate is not equal, right? And that's a very enormous change that was really impactful, difficult to implement. And unfortunately, if you read the next section there's a nice link to a study done, I believe, at UCLA. Yes, a UCLA study that found that schools are segregated again. This means that now, even though laws are not enforcing it, people are segregating themselves. So we want to look into that and think about that in our schools. How can we be more aware of the people that are not present in our schools and teach our kids about them? Because when we're not exposed to people that are different from us, we have long-term negative effects. The school to prison pipeline is a research area that many people are investigating lately. It has to do with stereotyping children, giving harsher consequences or more consequences to students of color. And it's called the school to prison pipeline because we often don't think about it at a young age, but we might be setting students on a path towards things like trouble with the law, or getting in trouble to the point where they're being arrested, because we're essentially pushing them out of the school system by suspending them and giving them lots of harsh consequences for minor offenses. And a lot of studies show that actually, if we compare by race, students of color are given the harsher consequence for the same offense. So that's a real issue we want to pay attention to in our classrooms and with our management and our classroom discipline. Another thing to think about from a historical perspective is what is left out in our curriculum. And a really important book that everybody should own a copy of is Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. There's some lovely videos there you can watch to get a background on it. But he basically did a whole history of the United States that covers all the groups of people that have been systemically left out of our textbooks. And it's really important for kids to learn about a range of different people, because it can be the perception that those people were not important or were not even present, which is not the case. And so we've tried to address that with multicultural education. We have things like Black History Month and Hispanic Heritage Month and all those sorts of things. But studies show that still only about 8 to 9% of the time are teachers actually covering those kinds of lessons in their classroom. So it's still a big issue concerning equity and representation in our curriculum and our lesson planning. Here's a perfect example of that. So we have a picture of a textbook. This was actually one of my nephew's books. I snapped a picture of it. And the issue here is that racism that is sort of embedded in our culture and our history can ultimately change how we view our identity, and how we view different people, historical figures, and it changes with lasting effects in our society. You can read that little description of Columbus there if you like. I will show you now a real depiction of Columbus. This is a primary source that Christopher Columbus wrote. I'm not going to read it to you, but I will let you pause it and read it yourself. Go ahead. Okay, now that you have read that, side note, I think it's kind of funny that often, we put here history is written by the victors. Apparently, if you're a victor, they even depict you as a little better looking, because this is a little more realistic image of what he looked like. And so you see here in the elementary school curriculum that is sort of outdated, obviously, It says he was more than an extraordinary navigator and sailor. He was a man of vision and determination. I'm not sure that's true. Now that we read this and we find out what he was really after, it sounds more like his vision and determination was to take from people and turn them into slaves because they were already not violent, and didn't see value in the same things he did. And he saw that as an opportunity to take advantage. And there's further primary sources that can support that. So that's a real concern if our history courses and our literature and our art and our science have not paid tribute to people who might have not been on the winning side of certain conflicts in history. So now that we know these are big issues, what do we do about it? All right, here's two concepts you can think about for application of addressing racial and cultural inequity in our classrooms. First, culturally relevant and responsive instruction is very important. There's lots of information out there in our own textbooks, as well as some important people that I've listed over here to the right. You can look up all kinds of things that they have written related to multicultural education and CRRI. There's a nice YouTube video there explaining it. And also, everybody knows I'm a big fan of Funds of Knowledge. Louise Moll and these other authors are very important people when it comes to that. And there's a lot of great new examples coming out of how teachers can implement Funds of Knowledge into all sorts of lessons. It allows students to bring in their own cultural capital into your class. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you in the next video. Keep up the good work.